everyone, and welcome back. Today I want to teach you how to solve a mystery. Most specifically, I want to talk to you about this lovely antique shoe. 18th century shoes are a bit of a complicated subject. It's because they are so well loved in terms of not only their design, but also their construction, that they are repeated throughout the years following. In fact, you start to see 18th century reproduction shoes as of the late 1840s. They rise again in the 1880s and yet again in the 19-teens and 20s. So there are many shoes out there that really do appear to be 18th century, and some of them are incredibly convincing, but in reality, they aren't. They're just reproductions. So how exactly can we tell that this shoe, for example, is actually from the 18th century? And more specifically, how can we actually date this shoe to when it was made originally? So I'm going to walk you through a lot of the different elements, not only in the design of these shoes, but also in the construction. You see, I have years of experience at this point as a historical shoemaker. So I've actually been making women's 18th century shoes for a while at this point, and there are a lot of very important things that you can discover when you are reproducing something. Things that go far above and beyond simply understanding the aesthetics of the era. So that's what we're going to really dive into today, and by the end, hopefully you too can someday solve the mystery of, is it actually an 18th century shoe, or does it just have a buckle? The first place I want to start us is not in the visual appearance of the shoe. It seems to be the most logical place to start would be with what we call the uppers, meaning the fabric or the leather that is on top. But in reality, that is where they tend to be the most tricky. That's where the reproductions really utilize the proportions or the elements such as buckles or latchets, or even the fabric and embroidery styles in order to imitate 18th century shoes. So we're going to leave that to the side for now, and we're going to start with something that's a little bit more clear, namely the fact that shoes are actually made over what are called wooden lasts. So a wooden last, such as this one here, is what actually gives the shoe its shape. So unlike clothing, which can be remade to fit a different body or to fit a different era just because there's so much fabric involved, you don't have that option with shoes. They are whatever shape the last is, and it's very difficult to make any alterations to a shoe. It doesn't really have seam allowance in it that's left over for you to adjust. So it is a one and done when it comes to its shape. So that gives us a very definitive thing. On top of that, when they're doing 18th century inspired shoes in the 19th or 20th centuries, they don't usually go and get 18th century shaped lasts. There might be some elements that are similar in terms of the toe shape coming back into style, but they won't go and actually make a new last just for that one style of shoe. They're not trying to trick us, they're just trying to be inspired. So looking at this particular shoe, we can see that it has a very pointed toe. Now, a pointed toe is something that is indicative of both the beginning and the end of the 18th century, but they are very different types of points. The late 18th century, from the 1780s through the 1790s, is a very low and flat point. It doesn't turn up at the end, and it tends to be a very narrow and dainty style. So this particular point is very typical of that 1780s, 1790s style. However, that pointed toe also comes back in the 19-teens, and therefore could also be from some of those styles. However, there are some things that quickly can tell us that that is not going to be the case with this shoe. You see, this particular shoe is what we call straight last, meaning that instead of having a right and a left, both the right and the left are made in the same way. They're symmetrical. As you wear the shoe, it quickly becomes right and left, but it's not made that way. The last is the same for both. So it is very simple to see when that change occurs in the mid-19th century. They write about it a lot, and so it is a very clear delineation returning to the right and left because we did it previously. So anything that is straight last has sort of an end date where you generally don't see it once you reach the 1850s. So that's a very telltale sign for this particular shoe. Following the sole up the shoe, we now come to the heel, which the heel shape is one of the least useful when it comes to dating shoes, in my opinion. Though this particular shoe can tell me, once I've narrowed it down to, say, the 18th century, that the heel is very narrow and it is fairly low, so it's likely going to sit somewhere in the 1780s or very early 1790s, because by the time we reach the late 1790s, the heel has dropped even lower and starts to disappear. However, this particular heel shape is not far off from, say, the heel shapes of the 1950s. So it is something that is constantly recurring, and that is true of all 18th century heels. You see, the curvy 18th century heel is one of the things that is the most distinct aesthetics of it, and it is the thing that keeps getting used over and over and over again through the centuries. However, there are a few very, very specific things about 18th century heels. One of which is the fact that they will extend far out under the arch of the foot. They don't go up straight in what we call the heel breast. They curve out and go very far under the foot. This is actually done in order to support the arch of the foot, rather than putting in what is called a shank, which in modern shoes tends to be fiberglass or metal. In early 20th century shoes, it tends to be cardboard. In the 18th century, they just simply used the extension of that heel. And though there are certainly heels later that sort of scoop out that direction, none of them tend to go as far as the 18th century heel did. So that is something which is very distinct and far less copied. Additionally, the way that the heel is attached is also a dead giveaway. You see, when heels go away after the 18th century, and then return in the 1850s, they very often don't use 18th century methods of attaching the heel. It's because it's a very difficult and very tedious process. Trust me, I know. It is by far my least favorite part of making women's 18th century shoes. It's very difficult because you actually have to attach the fabric cover for the heel around the curved insole and uppers, and then you insert the wooden heel and work the cover back over that wooden heel, then paste the sole down around it and stitch the whole thing closed. It requires a great deal of effort and time and handwork that they really weren't necessarily looking forward to doing in the 19th century. It was something that they certainly prized, because when they came up with the new system of heels, meaning knock-on heels, where the heel itself is covered and finished and made and simply nailed on to the shoe, they still continue to imitate and put fake stitching on the exterior of the heels in order to imitate 18th century stitching. So they understood how difficult it was and how impressive it was. They just didn't want to actually do it most of the time. I have seen a few examples where the heel was actually stitched on, but it seems to be a very rare and unusual situation. The same thing is true for how the sole itself is attached, not just at the heel, but the overall shoe. You see, cementing your shoes together comes into play in the 19th century and becomes very popular very quickly, and we still use that process today. In the 18th century, they still stitched their shoes together. And sometimes the stitching is visible in the case of welts or rands, or what we call channel shoes, where the stitching goes all the way straight up to the interior. But in the case of most women's shoes, they're turn shoes, meaning that the stitching actually runs midway through the sole and you will never see it on the exterior. Or at least you won't see it very easily. You might see ghosting of what I have heard in modern day called a ladder. So it's essentially that all of those little stitches that are put through the leather leave a little bit of a shadow, so you sort of see rungs running around the exterior edges of the shoe. This can tell you that it is in fact hand-stitched. However, the problem is it's not really useful because hand-stitching of women's shoes as a turn shoe style continues well into the 20th century. So it's not really a good definitive way of making sure that a shoe is as old as it looks. It can, however, tell you that if the shoe is cemented together, it's definitely older. So we've now gotten to understand how really the base works in these sorts of shoes and what is definitively 18th century. A few other clues can be things like nailing the heel cap on rather than using the wooden pegs that they regularly used in the 18th century. However, at some point someone might have replaced that heel cap and used nails, so I really don't want to make that the one thing that gives it away. But we now understand the basic concept of how these shoes are assembled on the base. So let's move on to that more tricky part we call the upper. So the upper in the 18th century for women's shoes is very often wool or silk or a colorful leather. There are certainly women's common shoes that are a stronger, hardier black leather, but most of the surviving ones that you find in museum collections tend to be silk. It's just because it's prettier and that's what they decided to keep around. So that is something that you see less often in later shoes. You do find metallic brocades in the 19-teens, sometimes silk brocades in the 1880s, but it doesn't tend to be the right fabrics, especially when it comes to leathers. Leathers changed between the 18th and the 19th centuries pretty drastically. So many of those supposed 18th century men's court shoes are very clearly 19th century because they have nearly patent leather. Patent leather is not around in the 18th century, by the way. So anything that is incredibly shiny and thin and glazed, anything that is metallic leather, anything that has vibrant, bright leathers used as the lining tends to be a very fast giveaway. They really liked doing that in the 19th century, not so much in the 18th. In fact, very often linings in the 18th are pretty boring. They're either a wittaw, which is a alum tawed leather rather than a tanned leather, so it comes out white, or they are a linen, whether it's a beetled linen. The place that I was actually introduced to it is inside of numerous 18th century women's shoes, or a bleached linen, which is a white, lighter color, and it's that combination that tends to make up the interior structure of the shoe, both the lining and little bits of reinforcements. So you might find that the toe and sort of the ball area of the foot has a little bit of reinforcement. Occasionally in some sturdier common shoes or men's shoes, you'll find that there is some heel reinforcement as well, but it tends to not be really, really stiff in comparison to the lightweight nature of the shoe. These really tend to fit your feet more like over-engineered socks than what we think of as modern shoes. So they're very lightweight on that internal structure and very plain on that lining. For the exterior, like I said, we have a very lovely silk. This particular shoe has some trim on it, but that trim has seen better days. So you can see that there is a little bit of ghosting along the very toe of the shoe and some leftover threads along the pleated ribbon trim, meaning that some of the trim did not survive the years. In fact, that little area on the toes becomes incredibly popular as a place for embroidery in the mid-1770s. But trim there, little rosettes or other things, continues well in through the 1790s. So again, the trim style of the shoe, the heel shape, the toe shape, the fact that it's straight last, the fact that all the hand stitching is visible on the shoe really starts to show us that it all matches up. It all starts to date it somewhere in that 1780s or early 1790s era. And that's a good thing. You want it to make sense. Shoes aren't really remade. Like I said earlier, they're made over a last. You can't really change their shape. You don't have extra seam allowance. If you try and say adjust the heel height down, the toe is actually going to sit upright and make it very uncomfortable to wear and likely put wrinkles and wear and tear on the shoe that shouldn't be there. So you want to make sure that the heel height matches with your last shape, and you can't change that later. I mean, I've seen a few 18th century shoes where they basically had worn them so much that the heel wore down and they were missing about half an inch of their heel by the end. Those poor shoes had been through some things anyway, so I don't think the toe spring was something that the wearer was really concerned about anymore. Additionally, with the style of the uppers, we can see that this is an open pump style, which comes in the 1780s. Sometimes they are low and scooped like this, sometimes they have a pointed tongue, but they are sort of leaving behind the latchets and buckles of the rest of the 18th century, which seems to be the quintessential 18th century shoe style, is to have a buckle. And you see this in shoe after shoe after shoe made throughout the 19th and 20th centuries as mimicking 18th century by just simply putting a buckle on it. But the proportion of the buckle and the placement of the buckle is very distinct to the era. It starts off very small and high, gradually moves down the foot, and so it's very large and low, and it's always a functional buckle in the 18th century, meaning that you have a removable buckle that fastens onto latchets that lay across the foot. Many of the later examples don't have latchets. It's simply a decorative buckle, very often with a very large and elaborate tongue. They proportionally didn't often do that in the vast majority of the 18th century. The tongue is there to sort of protect the foot from the buckle, but it's not there to be a massively decorative element in the same way that many of the later reproduction shoes show it off. So looking at this shoe, we don't have that quintessential buckle, but it is still a very typical style for the 1780s. And the last major clue, hand stitching of the uppers versus machine stitching. Sewing machines come into play by the mid-19th century in terms of common use in manufacturing processes. And shoemaking loves the sewing machine. It picks it up very fast for the uppers, and it will leave behind that hand stitching. So if you find an upper that is completely hand stitched, that is a very good sign. Now, you do still see some on later shoes, but it tends to be more like the buttonholes or some of the more complicated trimmings like binding of scalloped edges. But having a shoe that is completely hand-stitched is less and less common as we move throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries. While they're really looking to have these amazing new technological advancements, they keep constantly looking to the past as well. The 1851 Grand Exhibition is one of my favorite examples of how they're using such amazing new technology for shoes, but they're still looking to the past. You see, this is sort of the year that I can definitively say is what brought back what they call the high heel, meaning this is a high heel, anything over an inch at that point in time. And that is where we can see shoes going from being completely flat for most people to having a roughly 1.5 inch heel. And in part, this is because there were so many shoemakers who were trying to show off how much skill they had, show off their handwork, how tiny could their stitches be, how unusual could the shape of their shoe be. They really wanted to show the world that they were incredibly skilled, while still using all the technological advancements. So you actually see the return of heels mimicking 18th century heels at that point in time. Now, most of them are done as a knock-on style rather than stitched on, but they're still adding in those little stitch lines around the connection point between the heel cover and the sole as a way to show that, oh look, I can do tiny stitches just like they did in the 18th century. And that is the initial return of the 18th century shoe. And honestly, it really has never died. Like I said, you see it again in the 1880s, in the 19-teens. The shape of this shoe is very reminiscent of the styles that we see in the late 1950s and 1960s. And there are buckle shoes again in the 1970s. And I've continued to see curvy heels go in and out of style over the years of my lifetime. So the ghost of the 18th century shoe is still ever present and recurring throughout history. We've never really left it entirely behind. And that's why it can be so difficult sometimes to understand the difference between an actual 18th century shoe and simply one that mimics it. But as for this shoe, we've solved the mystery. All of the parts agree, there's nothing incongruent, and every single part of it really does fit well within the 1780s and early 1790s period. And hopefully this will allow you to go off and look at shoes in museums or shoes up for auction online and have a better understanding of what exactly you're looking at, and maybe find a few examples of shoes that, well, have managed to trick us.